Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show that y'all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. We've been doing that for some 32 years here at FFF. I am not joined by my co-host Richard Ebeling, as you can see this week. That's because he teaches school at the Citadel, which is located in Charleston, South Carolina, which is, as of right now, right in the direction of Hurricane Ian. So Richard is in the process of evacuating, along with his wife, that area of the state. So you get a solo this week, and I thought it would be a nice opportunity to talk to you about healthcare, and specifically the coronavirus, the pandemic, the thing we've been dealing with, the big crisis in healthcare we've been dealing with for, gosh, how long now? 2.5 years or so. And before things get all ramped up again, if there's a resurgence or a big resurgence in COVID deaths where rational thinking might be in short supply again, I thought, well, let me do a recap here in the Libertarian Angle of what happened here and how this crisis has been addressed by conservatives, liberals, and libertarians, including the reform-oriented wing of the libertarian movement. Now, before I do that, though, I'd like to deal with the legal issues here, because they're kind of interesting. They're not as simple as people make out to be. And I want to put the framework of what I think is a free society in the context of some of the legal issues that are involved here. And I won't have all the detailed analysis that could go into this, but I just want to kind of bring the big picture here with respect to the legal issues that we're dealing with. We're dealing with two layers of government, of course: the federal government, the national government, and state governments. The federal government, when it was called into existence by the Constitution, was set up as a government of limited powers. Now, we all take this for granted today, that concept, but it was actually very unusual, shockingly unusual, because throughout history, governments had what are normally called the police powers, or inherent powers to do the right thing for the citizenry. And the police powers would go by four names: health, safety, morals, and welfare. And those are the traditional powers, that the state can do whatever it wants to, so long as it's in the interests of health, safety, morals, and welfare. Now, safety, all of us libertarians can relate to. We're talking about there, going after murderers, rapists, thieves, people who commit fraud and so forth. Anybody who initiates force or fraud against another person. The other ones, not so much within the libertarian movement. Health, morals, and welfare. Health we'll talk about today. Morals, prostitution laws, drug laws. And then, of course, the welfare, providing welfare doles to people in various ways. So we'll talk about health care today. But when the federal government was set up, people were very leery. Americans had a mindset toward government that was totally unlike the mindset that Americans today have. They were very leery. They didn't trust any government, including the federal government. For example, they had operated under the Articles of Confederation for some 10 years. And the Articles had a federal government, but its powers were so weak that, get this, it didn't even have the power to tax. So the federal government operates for 10 years or so with no power to forcibly take money from people. Quite amazing. So when the Constitutional Convention met, it was really just to modify the Articles. That was its purpose, because there had been some trade wars between the states and other problems, and they wanted to see if they could get these things corrected. And instead they came up with a brand new governmental structure that goes by the name of a limited government republic. So it was a government where people would be democratically elected, but their powers, once they got into office, would be limited to the powers enumerated in the Constitution. People were shocked all over the world. They had never heard of where people are telling government what it can and cannot do, because they're always accustomed to government having the power to tell people what they can and cannot So Americans were still leery, but they went ahead along with the deal, as long as, The government couldn't exercise powers that weren't enumerated in the Constitution. But to make sure federal officials got the point, they demanded the enactment of the Bill of Rights as a condition of accepting the Constitution. And this really was a bill of prohibitions because it prohibited federal officials from doing bad things to people. Bad things that Americans were convinced they would do, like deprive them of freedom of speech, put them in jail for criticizing the government, or taking away their right to keep and bear arms, and these kind of things, force them to go to church. And so they said, no, you don't have the power to do these things. And then an interesting group of amendments was the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, which dealt with what happens when federal officials want to kill people. And because they were convinced that they would ultimately turn their guns on the citizens and foreigners alike. And they said, well, before you can kill people, this is what you have to do. You have to comply with due process and try by jury and so forth. And then the 9th Amendment says, look, just because we've enumerated some rights here doesn't mean that all of them are there. People have many more rights, inherent rights, that you can't take away that are not enumerated here. And then the 10th Amendment says, well, the powers that are not given to the federal government are reserved to the states. So you had this enumerated powers concept. Now, the states were totally different. They were like the European governments. They had the inherent powers of government, the health, safety, morals, and welfare, to pass any laws dealing with that. And so if the states wanted to enact a law that forced people to go to church on Sunday, or to send their kids to school, or to send their kids to church on Sunday, they had the power to do that. Because the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, applied to the federal government, not to the state governments. Now, it's possible that a state constitution might guarantee rights. It could be modeled on the federal Constitution and apply only to that state. But absent that, states could do whatever they wanted. Subject to what happened when the 14th Amendment came along, because then you've got a whole new ballgame now. Because the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause, says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And so that certainly enters the picture when you start talking about lockdowns and mandates and so forth, is that, can the state do this under the 14th Amendment? So you have a conflict there with the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause and the state's inherent powers to legislate in the health area as part of its inherent police powers. So if we look at the federal level, there is no question but that there is no authority, no power given the federal government to legislate in the interest of health care. It just doesn't exist. You can search the Constitution forever and you're not going to find it. There is no power to control, provide, regulate health care. And so whatever the federal government was doing was illegitimate from the start in terms of the Constitution. But on the state level, it's a different ballgame now with respect to the police powers, because the state was saying when it imposed the lockdowns, and that's where the lockdowns were coming, the mandates were coming. The federal government really wasn't imposing these lockdowns on restaurants and stores and so forth. They were doing mandates, like the airline industry. I think that was declared unconstitutional. I think they were imposing a vaccine mandate. I'm not sure. They certainly were doing mask mandates. Maybe that was what was done on the airline that was declared unconstitutional. They required mandates in federal buildings like the post office and so forth, which really is an argument for why we need to get rid of the federal government and postal delivery. But in federal courts and so forth. But as far as I know, there was never a vaccine mandate issued by the federal government. Now, there was a lot of pronouncements coming out of the White House by Anthony Fauci, the president's medical advisor, and the head of some agency. I forget the name of it. And then there's the Centers for Disease Control, and there's the FDA, and then so most of the focus that I've seen from reform-oriented libertarians and from conservatives was on Fauci. For the last 2.5 years, it was Fauci, 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 Fauci this and Fauci that, and Fauci shouldn't do this and Fauci shouldn't do that. Well, the problem with that approach is that it sort of feeds into the old conservative mindset that a lot of the reform-oriented libertarians have accepted. And that is that the real problem with the system is that we just got to get better people into public office. That if only we didn't have Fauci and we had somebody better, we had some real healthcare professional, or even better yet, a conservative in there, or a libertarian-leaning conservative, or a libertarian in there, everything would be hunky-dory. And so it feeds into this notion that if we can just get better people into public office, the welfare state way of life, or the warfare state way of life, can finally succeed. And I challenge that, I question that, because that's not what freedom is all about. Freedom is about getting government out of healthcare entirely. A separation of healthcare in the state, just like we've separated church and state. Our ancestors did, and they bequeathed that to us. I mean, imagine if we'd been living under state churches for, umpteen years, 260 years or so, and they were corrupt, and people were dissatisfied, and people were being forced to go to church on Sunday, or being forced to send their kids to church on Sunday, and then you have this whole wing of the libertarian movement saying, we just got to get better people in charge of the churching system, the state churching system, or we need a voucher program that enables people to take their kids out of the state churching system and put into private churches. And well, that's not freedom. Freedom is about separating church and state. We know that. And so what I've said for 32 years, the libertarian movement, the special role that it has in restoring a free society to our land, is to stay focused in arguing what freedom entails, what it requires. Because when you mix it with this conservative concept of reform or getting better people in public office, the mindset out there among non-libertarians is, the libertarian movement is just a conservative right-wing libertarian hash or mush. I say, leave it to the conservatives, leave it to the Republicans, leave it to the Democrats on this argument of we got to get somebody better than Fauci, or we've got to get a better reform in there, or that there shouldn't be lockdowns and so forth. Because all that feeds into is that, if only we had better people, they would be better managing. They wouldn't have lockdowns. Well, that may well be, but it's not freedom. Freedom is getting the state entirely out of the business of healthcare, and that's really what the Constitution essentially says when it says that there's no power to legislate for healthcare here. So that's my beef with all this Fauci. And when Fauci finally resigns, it's like, this huge celebration, like, what a tremendous victory, if only this had happened. And the implication is, if only we had gotten somebody else in there early on, everything would be so much better. Well, maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't, but it wouldn't be freedom. An analogy here is that several years ago, a libertarian-leaning conservative, or so he described himself, got appointed to head the Federal Communications Commission. And the reform-oriented part of the libertarian movement was ecstatic. They were celebrating, they were honoring this guy, praising him, glorifying him, and saying he's going to bring free enterprise approaches to the Fifth CC. And they were saying this is like freedom, free enterprise approaches, and all that does is reinforce the image that libertarians are about just getting better people in public office, which is a conservative mindset. It's a mindset that's really been imported into the libertarian movement. Well, that's not what freedom's about. Freedom's about abolishing the FCC, getting people out, free of this regulatory process on speech and what they publish and so forth. And so I continue to emphasize that leave those arguments to the conservatives, leave them to the Republicans, because when you import them into the libertarian movement, the libertarian philosophy becomes a mush, a conservative, libertarian, maybe even liberal mush, where people start thinking of the libertarian movement as a right-wing movement or a conservative movement or a subset of the conservative movement, because all it's trying to do is getting right-wingers in charge of regulatory commissions, when really our focus should be on freedom, which necessarily means removing infringements on freedom, not getting better people to run them, not getting better reforms, but getting rid of the infringement itself. And that's really where the argument should have been focused for the last 2.5 years, is let's separate healthcare and the state. You can make the argument that Fauci is screwing everything up, but as part of the overall argument of we need to get rid of government out of here. You see, now what Fauci's doing takes on a whole different color here. Because it's not just implying, oh, we need a libertarian in there to run this system. It's saying we need to get government out of here, and the best example of this is all the screw-ups that Fauci's doing. And it's not just Fauci's business, it's his entity, whatever it's called. It's the Centers for Disease Control. It needs to go. It needs to get wiped out, abolished, the FDA, and leave healthcare to the free market. And same thing at the state level, is that we need a separation of healthcare in the state. In other words, we need to remove this historically inherent power of health, well, morals and welfare too, but we'll set those aside for right now, out of the hands of the state. The ideal would be like a constitutional amendment, just like our ancestors enacted the Bill of Rights, that says no law shall be enacted by either the federal or the state governments respecting the regulation of health care or abridging the free exercise thereof. There you got it. You've got a separation of health care in the state at both levels. So then therefore, now the state doesn't have the authority to do anything in health care. It can't order a lockdown. So instead of just focusing on, the lockdowns, the mandates, which implies that the government officials are not doing a good job, and that we need better people in public office to do a good job. Now you're bringing people's vision to a higher level, to what it means to be free. You're not looking for better people to run this thing. You're looking for freedom, which means getting the state entirely out of healthcare. How would that have looked with respect to the coronavirus? Well, the healthcare industry would have announced, it looks like we're going to have a pandemic here. And, everybody would have been shocked. We haven't dealt with pandemics in our lifetime, and everybody would have been maybe a little bit afraid. And they, instead of looking to the state, to the politicians and the bureaucrats who have no real expertise when it comes to healthcare, the people with the expertise are the people in the healthcare industry. They would look to them. What are they advising? One group over here, physicians and medical experts, are saying, well, we think there should be lockdowns. Restaurants should lock down. And another group, and let's stick with that group. We think everybody should wear masks, and we think everybody should do vaccines. And then you got another healthcare section that's saying this. Well, people have to make their own choices. They would listen to this group, they'd listen to this group, and they'd weigh the argument. There's no perfect world here, people die of these things. People die of the flu, okay, of the regular flu. And how do they die? Because they catch it from somebody who had the flu. Life is precarious. There's no question about it. And so people would make their own choices. But there wouldn't have been a state active mandate that says all stores have to close down for a certain period of time, which caused devastation for people. Instead, this is what would have happened. A restaurant owner, for example, would have done his research, checked around, see what people were doing, how people were feeling. And he says, okay, I want everybody who goes into my restaurant to show proof of vaccination and wear a mask. And that's his policy. Okay, that's his right. It's his store. It's his restaurant. But by the same token, consumers have a choice too. They can say, no, I don't believe in masks. I don't believe in vaccinations. I think they're harmful. So the restaurant owner across the street says, well, anybody that comes into my restaurant can wear a mask if he wants to, can get vaccinated if he wants to. I don't care. And so those people that are skeptical of masks and vaccines, they would go over to the second guy. And then, so everybody gets his choice the way he wants it. It would be, deciding, the matter's being decided in terms of the market. And some businesses might go out of business. They might get nudged to change their policy because of this. But then this is where people are making their own choices. They're taking their own risk. They're balancing risk and living life. And if a person wanted to be totally safe, they just stay in their home. As you all know, grocery stores started delivering to the home and knocking on the door and leaving the groceries there. And so, there's ways to presumably to be kept perfectly safe. You don't ever talk to anybody, and don't let your family members out to talk to anybody. But we all know that that's not life. I mean, you got to balance risk with living life. And that's the way it would have worked in a free market. You wouldn't have seen this massive bankruptcy of so many businesses and so forth, because the market would have been ferreting it all out. That's the ideal. And so when there's another aspect to this, that during this crisis, during the past 2.5 years or so, there's been this big focus among libertarians about anti-masks and anti-mandates. I mean, for example, let's say a libertarian goes to a school board meeting and he's going to talk against the mask mandates. And he says, I'm a libertarian and I want to make it clear that we're against these mask mandates in these classrooms. Well, the danger of that is that it creates the appearance that libertarianism involves being anti-mask or anti-vaccine. And in fact, that was the impression that was being given out in large part by many of the people that were opposed to masks and vaccines. But nothing could be further from the truth. Libertarianism has nothing to do with being anti-mask or anti-vaccine. Libertarianism is all about leaving people free to make the choice on their own. That's all libertarianism is. And in that context, people make their own choices. Now, obviously, libertarians are like anybody else. They're going to make their own choices. They may personally be anti-mask and anti-vaccine, but it has nothing to do with libertarianism. It just has to do with making choices in life. Take education, for example. That suppose you had a separation of school and state, like we have a separation of church and state. And so you've got this multiplicity of educational vehicles, homeschooling, private schools, tutorial schools, online schools, and so forth. And a libertarian says, oh, I think homeschooling is terrible. Parents aren't competent to do this. And I'm just using that as an example. I think most libertarians are in favor of homeschooling. But you see, libertarianism has nothing to do with criticizing another vehicle like homeschooling or private schools or tutorials or anything. Libertarianism is all about the freedom to choose. And so the danger of focusing in on going to a school board and saying, I'm a libertarian, I'm going to make it clear that I oppose this mask mandate, is that it creates the impression that libertarians are anti-mask. And nothing could be further from the truth, as I'm saying here. Now, how should that be handled at the school board? I wouldn't waste my time. For me, going to a school board meeting to tell the state how to run its schools is just a waste of time. For me, we libertarians should stay focused on freedom, and that is to continue establishing the case for a separation of school and state, the same way our ancestors separated healthcare in the state. I mean, church and state, in the same way I'm saying we ought to separate healthcare in the state. Let the Republicans and the Democrats handle how to run their socialist systems, and that's what public schooling is. Libertarianism has never been a vehicle, never meant to be a vehicle on how to make socialism work or how to resolve the crises that socialism brings. Libertarianism has always been about freedom, which means getting government out of education and then letting people make their own choices. And so I want to emphasize that libertarianism is no more anti-mask and anti-vaccination than it is pro-mask and pro-vaccination. It's not either one. It's the freedom to make these choices. Now, I also want to make another point that I think is so important that you haven't heard of in the last 2.5 years. As far as I know, I haven't heard it. There's been total silence in this whole pandemic about Medicare. I mean, to me, this is phenomenal because before the pandemic, as you recall, there was a huge healthcare crisis already. The pandemic just added another crisis. But Medicare, I mean, we know it was in crisis, and healthcare costs were soaring. They still are. That's what Obamacare was all about, to try to fix the Medicare system, the Medicaid system. Even that was failing. They were talking about a full government takeover. None of that's gone away. And so by this is one of the downsides of the coronavirus, is that there's been no focus at all on this major crisis in healthcare, which is Medicare and Medicaid. America had the finest healthcare system in the world. And that was a free market healthcare system. When I was growing up, nobody had health care insurance, major medical insurance. They might have had catastrophic, but nobody had, or very few people had major medical, because going to the doctor was like going to the grocery store. Who has grocery store insurance to protect against soaring prices? Well, I guess maybe that market's going to be developed based on what's happening now with the Federal Reserve's inflationary policies for the last 12 years or so. Grocery store prices are soaring. But back then, everything was low and stable. And so people just paid the doctor right there on the visit. It was like no big deal. It was like going to the grocery store, like I say. And healthcare inventions and innovations were soaring. Doctors loved what they did in life. Doctors made house calls because they loved it so much. And then Medicare and Medicaid are adopted, and that's the end of the system. Right there. That's the root cause. At that point, it was over. This massive socialist system that could have easily been imported from communist China or communist Cuba, it would fit perfectly in those countries, ends up destroying. That's the source of the soaring healthcare costs. But instead of getting rid of this thing, they enact Obamacare. And it's like, you have cancer and you make the cancer worse with Obamacare instead of cutting out the cancer and throwing it away. But that crisis is still there. And so by focusing exclusively on the mandates and Fauci, we haven't done what we need to do to achieve healthcare freedom in this country, and that is focus on separating healthcare in the state, which encompasses repealing Medicare and Medicaid, the root cause of the destruction of this finest healthcare system in history. And so I got no problems with complaining about Fauci and about what he was recommending and what he was doing and so forth. But it would be better to put it in the context of what we libertarians are striving to achieve, not getting a replacement for Fauci, which is the implication, but by getting the state out of healthcare entirely. When we had the Medicaid crisis, that's a socialist system. Government's providing health care. The left, the Democrats, are now trying to get a full-fledged socialist system, like in China or North Korea or something. This is where the failure of their system causes them to finally go all the way and say, well, we need a full government takeover instead of getting rid of the original cancer. And so you have this half of the system, but what was always being kept sort of hidden, not completely hidden, was this other half, which really is like a fascist system, a government control system. And that was the Centers for Disease Control and this entity appointed that Fauci is in charge of, the FDA. We would talk about the FDA, libertarians, but you have two halves of this healthcare problem. You've got at the federal level, you've got the Medicare and Medicaid over here, a socialist system, the Centers for Disease Control over here, that surfaced during the pandemic, and we saw the tyranny that this can bring, especially as it funneled down to the state level. So, to recap here, what we libertarians are all about, we're about freedom. We're not about reform. We shouldn't be about reform. If we had lived in 1855 Alabama, would we have spent our time trying to reform slavery? Some would have. They would have said, oh, Jacob, slavery's here. The public opinion's against us. Nobody's ready for freedom. They'll never vote for us. We need to be practical. We have to be pragmatic. We got to fight for better slavery. Fewer lashings and better food for the slaves. Or would we have been better off just saying no? Leave those reform arguments to the conservatives and the liberals. Let's us libertarians just keep making the case for why slavery should be ended, why it's immoral, why it's wrong, why it's destructive. And I say that's what we need to be doing across the board, and especially on healthcare, which is so important, such an important part of our lives. Is leave the reform, leave the getting better people into public office over to the conservatives, to the liberals. And let us libertarians keep people focused on one thing, and that's liberty. Because if we try to mix the two, we end up with a indecipherable mush that ends up more and more by default turning into reform, in which case people view the libertarian philosophy and the libertarian movement as nothing more than a philosophy that is a subset of conservatism and designed to improve the welfare, warfare state way of life that we all know as libertarians is not freedom. That if we stay focused solely on what freedom is and the benefits of freedom and the morality of freedom, we have the best shot, especially in these times, chaotic times, when it seems that people are asking questions about where we are as a country. How did we get here? And especially in foreign policy as well, where we're getting perilously close to extinction of mankind with an accidental or even intentional nuclear war. People are asking questions. And when there's that type of soul searching going on, we're the only hope. We libertarians are the only hope for this. But that hope has to come in terms of what we have to offer. And what we have to offer the American people is a genuinely free